This is Audible.
Blackstone Publishing presents Disney: The Lion King, adapted by Elizabeth Rudnik. This book is read by Janina Edwards. Chapter 1. In the moments before the sun rose over the horizon, the African plain was hushed. No birds sang, no animals called. The only sounds were the soft whisper of the breeze as it blew through the long grasses, still green in the early spring, and the distant thunder of the water cascading over Victoria Falls into the frothy pools below. But as the sun's light began to break over the savannah, life began to stir. It was slow at first, barely noticeable, a soft mew rising from the meerkat den, a rustle of feathers as the marabou storks lifted their long black wings and stretched their necks. Then faster and faster, the sounds grew louder, merging into the song of the savannah. Cheetah mothers coaxed their young out into the sunlight with gentle nudges to their cubs' sides and quick licks to say hello. A pair of tulpies tapped their horns in greeting and then turned toward the grasslands, eager for their first meal of the day. Their brown bodies, marked with swaths of black, glimmered in the sun as it rose higher and higher. Over the open plains, a herd of elephants began to march toward the watering hole, their long trunks swinging, the pads of their large feet leaving deep impressions on the dry ground. Near the top of a hill, a mother giraffe appeared, her baby following close behind, its head swiveling back and forth as it scanned the landscape for friends and predators. Below, on a plain still covered with a thin layer of morning mist, a herd of gazelles leapt and played, the young ones jumping over brush with abandon and then spooking as an even larger herd of zebras passed by. Even the smallest of life had awoken. On tree branches, ants began to march out of their holes and head to ground, careful to stay out of the way of the hungry guinea fowl. Tiny birds flew from branch to branch, the boldest occasionally swooping down to catch a ride on a passing elephant. As all the animals of the savannah continued to wake, the sound grew to a crescendo until finally it broke with a loud trumpet from an elephant. But beneath the peace was a growing sense of excitement that every animal, from the largest to the smallest, felt. It was why, in almost perfect synchrony and complete harmony, they began to make their way to Pride Rock. The heart of their part of the savannah, Pride Rock, was where Mufasa, the giant lion who had led the land for years, and his pride of lions lived. And on this day, he would introduce his kingdom to his son. It was a tradition that had been upheld for generations. Mufasa's family was well respected. He was a fierce and mighty lion, but he was kind, and he treated everyone, from the ants to the antelope, as important. In return, he had earned the respect of every animal family in the Pride Lands, and now they would show their respect by greeting his new son. The sun had fully risen in the sky by the time all the animals arrived at Pride Rock. A hush fell over them as they raised their heads to look at the large rock jutting out over the savannah. It dominated the landscape, casting those nearest to it in shadow. For years, it had been the symbol of their kingdom, a natural amphitheater and gathering place. In the wet season, it provided shelter, and in the dry season, it was a refuge from the brutal sun. But most importantly, it was where Mufasa and his queen, Sarabi, lived with their pride of lions. Now it was a stage, and everyone was eager for the show to begin. As they waited inside the cave, tucked in the back of Pride Rock, Mufasa looked down at his queen. Beside her, their young son, Simba, slept peacefully, unaware of what was in store. His light brown body was relaxed, his sides rising evenly as he breathed in and out. Lowering her head, Sarabi gently nuzzled the young cub. Simba's eyes slowly opened. At the comforting sight of his mother and father, he let out a big yawn and then stretched. Mufasa smiled proudly, watching him. He had done many great things in his life, but the thing he was most proud of was this: his son, his queen, and the life he had created for them. Hearing footsteps, Mufasa turned, and his grin grew wider. His old friend and confidant Rafiki had arrived. Although the mandrill was a bit grizzled and bent, his eyes were still bright. He leaned on his wooden staff a little more than he once had, but his steps were still light. It had been Rafiki who had introduced Mufasa to the kingdom when he was just a cub, as he would do now with Simba. Approaching each other, the two old friends exchanged a hug, and then Mufasa stepped aside. It was time for the ceremony to begin. Simba watched curiously as the monkey stepped in front of him. Seeing his wooden stick, the cub playfully tried to bat at it, missing and causing the adults around him to laugh. Rafiki nodded, pleased. It was a good sign for all of Pride Rock, if Simba was curious and alert. Raising the stick above Simba, Rafiki shook it, causing red dirt to fall over the cub's head and making the young cub sneeze. Satisfied, Rafiki leaned down and carefully picked up Simba. Cradling him in one arm, he turned and slowly began to make his way out of the cave. Behind him, Mufasa and Sarabi followed, their bodies pressed close together. As they came out onto the rock, the sun went behind a cloud, as if not wanting to take away from the moment. Below, the animals leaned forward in anticipation. Step by step, Rafiki made his way toward the edge of Pride Rock until at last he stopped, mere inches from the steep drop. As the gathered animals watched from below, Rafiki lifted Simba up, up, until finally he had raised baby Simba for all to see. Instantly, the gathered animals erupted in noise. Elephants trumpeted, zebras stomped their feet, storks flapped their wings, and the cheetahs let out their own cries. Then the sun burst through the clouds, a beam of light falling right down onto the head of Simba, the future king. The animals dropped their heads, bowing in respect. Simba, still hanging from Rafiki's arms, looked down upon it all, unaware of the greatness of this moment. This was the way of life on Pride Rock. It was how it had always been, and how it should always be. It was the circle of life, the way of the savannah. Through times of hardship and times of ease, the animals relied on one another and on the order of life to keep them going. Now it was Simba's turn to join that circle. And while he didn't know it yet, someday it would be up to him to take his father's place and complete the circle when he was king. While nearly every animal in the savannah had come to greet their future king, there was someone missing. Someone whose presence, while not missed by others, was keenly felt by Mufasa. His brother, Scar, had missed the event. Staring at the spot that had been kept open for him, Mufasa sighed. Once again, his brother had disappointed him. He had hoped that just this once, Scar would step up, prove that he was above petty jealousies. But his hopes had been in vain. Scar had acted as he always had, bitter and resentful, angry to the core. As Mufasa followed Rafiki and Sarabi back into the cave, his eyes wandered down to the shadows beneath Pride Rock, where Scar made his home. Anger began to replace the disappointment he felt. Yes, Scar had been born second. That was not Mufasa's fault. Yet somehow, he had become the villain in the story of Scar's life. Mufasa knew the younger lion blamed him for his lower position. Scar was a fool and a bitter lion, content to slink about, stirring discontent among the young lions, and mocking and disrespecting his brother at every turn, like he had done that day. Nodding at his major domo, a hornbill named Zazu, Mufasa signaled him over. Making sure not to bother Sarabi or Simba, who was in the middle of a bath, Mufasa whispered his directions to Zazu. "Go and tell Scar I'm not pleased," he said, his deep voice commanding, even in whisper. "I'll be down shortly to hear what his excuse is, this time." His orders given, he turned his attention back to his family. He wanted to spend a few more minutes enjoying them, not as a king, but as a father. Then he would go talk to Scar, not as his brother, but as his king. Chapter 2. Inside his cave, Scar sat in the shadows. He could hear the muffled sounds of celebration drifting in from outside. The cave shook as the animals paraded around Pride Rock, trumpeting and roaring in excitement over the presentation of beloved little Simba. Scar's eyes narrowed, and he swiped a paw angrily at the ground in front of him. Was it too much to ask for them to be just a tad quieter? So much fuss for such a tiny cub. It was disgusting, and just like his big brother, the mighty king loved a good show. Trying to tune out the noise, Scar focused on a much more pressing task, his afternoon snack. Lowering himself into a crouch, he shifted farther back into the shadows and waited. Within moments, the cave grew eerily quiet, as though Scar had stopped breathing and moving altogether. Out on the savannah, the skill would have made him a mighty hunter, but the scar on his eye had made him ineffectual to his father, so he had never been brought along on hunts, never shown the way of the hunter. Inside his cave, however, he was the mightiest of warriors. No one judged his weak appearance, his ribs always protruding no matter how much he ate, his mane mangy and thin, his coat mottled and turning prematurely gray, his mismatched eyes, one bright, the other clouded and scarred. No, inside his cave, he was the king, and he was about to get a meal. A mouse, lulled into a false sense of security by the quiet, scampered out into the center of the cave. He lifted his nose to the air, and his whiskers twitched, his little eyes darting back and forth. Convinced he was well and truly alone, he scurried forward, his nose pressed to the ground as he searched for a crumb. Focused on his task, the little mouse didn't notice as a shadow rose up on the cave wall behind him. Slowly, Scar got to his feet, his hackles raising and his eyes narrowing as he fixed on his prey. This was his favorite part. The moment before he pounced, when he was steps ahead of his victim. Mufasa had always been the brawnier of the two, but Scar, he was the brainier, and he loved a good game of cat and mouse. Inching forward, he was soundless, the pads of his giant paws barely touching the cold, hard ground of the cave. When he was almost on top of the mouse, he lifted one paw up. It hung in the air above the mouse for a second, and then slammed down, trapping the creature against the wall. A sneer of pleasure came over Scar's face. Behind his paw, he could feel the mouse frantically trying to escape, but there was nowhere to go. Lifting his paw, he brought his nose down right in front of the frightened creature. "Life's not fair, is it, my little friend?" he said. He was so close to the mouse that his breath made the small animal's fur move. While some are born to feast, others spend their lives in the dark, begging for scraps. The way I see it, you and I are exactly the same. He lowered his head still closer, silently laughing at the irony of comparing himself to a mouse. But it was true. They were the same. They were both stuck in their situations. And while he may have been born into the proudest of families, Scar was seen as no mightier than a mouse. Sighing, he went on. "We both want to find a way out." Lifting the mouse up by his tail, Scar let him squirm for a moment. He would never grow tired of the pleasure it gave him to make the weak suffer. And why should he? He was the weak one in his family. And look at what they had done to him. Cast him aside, treated him like dirt while they showered Mufasa with praise and attention. Scar would never be king. That much was a given, especially now that the little brat had been born. But it didn't mean he couldn't find some source of joy, even if it came in the form of herding creatures too small to fight back. With renewed focus, Scar opened his mouth and began to lower the mouse down. He was just about to snap his jaws shut when he heard flapping wings. A moment later, the unmistakable sound of Zazu's voice echoed throughout the cave. "The king approaches," the hornbill cried. "This is not a drill." At the word king, Scar's grip on the mouse loosened. It was just for a moment, but it was all the mouse needed. Jumping free of Scar and away from his still open mouth, the mouse sprinted toward the small hole through which he had come. Before Scar could even let out a growl of frustration, his snack had disappeared. In its place stood Zazu. Sitting down, Scar eyed the nervous bird. He hated Zazu, almost as much as he despised Mufasa. The bird felt that just because he was Mufasa's trusted aide, he could go anywhere and say anything. It was irritating, as was his habit of constantly being nervous and in a state of fear. Not that anyone could touch the bird without punishment from the king. Feeling the lion's gaze on him, Zazu scanned the cave. His nose dipped down as he took in the dirty surroundings, the matted thin bed in the corner, and the remains of Scar's last snack. Then he looked up at Scar. "His Majesty has requested an audience," he announced. "Upon his entrance, you will rise and genuflect." Scar ignored him, looking instead at the spot in the cave wall where the mouse had gone. "Zazu," he said, dragging out the hornbill's name and managing to sound completely put off. "You've made me lose my lunch." Zazu did not seem concerned. "You'll answer to Mufasa for missing the ceremony this morning." Instantly, Scar was on his feet. He began to move toward the bird, his head lowered and his lips pulled back in a snarl. If Zazu thought he could just fly in and command him to bow and act sorry, he was a stupider bird than Scar had believed. As he got closer, he licked his lips hungrily. "Scar," Zazu said, beginning to back up, "don't look at me like that." "Are you hungry, Zazu?" Scar asked, not stopping. "Perhaps we could have a bite together." Hearing the hunger and hatred in Scar's voice, Zazu lifted up off the floor of the cave. He could wait for Mufasa outside just as easily as inside. But before he could turn and fly away, Scar lunged forward, blocking the entrance to the den. His body shut out the sunshine and cast the entrance into shadow. Zazu shivered. "You can't eat me," he said, trying to keep his voice from shaking, and failing. In answer, Scar snapped his jaws. With a squawk, Zazu lifted into the air, barely avoiding having his beak bitten in half. Below him, Scar snapped again and again, the sound echoing and bouncing off the walls of the den. "Scar!" Backlit by the sun, Mufasa filled the entire entrance to the den. His massive mane looked the color of fire, but his eyes were cold as they stared down at Scar. "Well, look who's come down to mingle with the commoners," Scar finally said, eyeing his brother and Zazu with disdain. He lifted a paw and began to groom himself. "Come out here," Mufasa ordered. He knew exactly what Scar was doing. He was trying to act as though he didn't have a care in the world. But Mufasa knew different. He knew Scar hadn't shown because of one reason and one reason alone: jealousy. Stepping back, he waited for the other lion to follow him. Slowly, Scar slunk out in the sunshine. He squinted, unaccustomed to the bright light. He began to walk around Mufasa, checking to be sure the king hadn't brought anyone else along with him. But Mufasa was alone. "Sarabi and I didn't see you at the presentation of Simba," Mufasa finally said. He lifted his head toward the top of Pride Rock, high above them. His body was relaxed, but his tone made his displeasure clear. He didn't bother to look at Scar, instead just waiting to hear the excuse. Pausing in front of a large rock, Scar flicked out a long, sharp talon and began to run it over the hard surface. Zazu grimaced at the painful noise, but Mufasa didn't flinch. "Was that today?" Scar said. "Must have slipped my mind." He shrugged. "Of course I meant no disrespect toward His Majesty or Sarabi. As you know, I have tremendous respect for the Queen." His voice trailed off, his omission blatant. Zazu's head swiveled back and forth between the two brothers. It was never comfortable being in the same area as them, but now it was downright frightening. He could feel the rage practically boiling off Mufasa, and he could smell the indifference on Scar. Clearing his throat, the Hornbill took a step forward. "As the king's brother, you should have been first in line," he pointed out, voicing what Mufasa had obviously been thinking. Scar lifted an eyebrow, the movement pulling at his scar and making him look even meaner than usual. Was Zazu joking? Did he not see the irony in what he'd said? "I was first in line," he reminded them. "Or don't you remember? That is, until the precious prince arrived." Tired of the conversation, Scar turned to walk away. He had more important things to do than be chastised by a bird and his bird-brained brother, like find his runaway lunch. "Don't turn your back on me, Scar." At the sound of Mufasa's voice, Scar reeled back around. He had had enough. "Oh no, Mufasa," he snarled. "Perhaps you shouldn't turn your back on me." "Is that a challenge?" Mufasa roared. Lifting his head, he puffed out his chest and squared off against Scar. For a long, tense moment, the two lions stood there, eyes locked, until finally Scar lowered his head and began to back away. He was small, but he was not foolish. There was no point in fighting. "I wouldn't dream of challenging you." He stopped, and then added, "Again." Mufasa's hackles rose, and a growl began at the back of his throat. But before he could snap, Zazu flew in between them. "A wise decision," he said to Scar. "You are no match for his royalness." Scar shrugged. "Well, as far as brains go, I've got the lion's share. But when it comes to brute strength, I'm afraid my big brother will always rule." "Not always," Mufasa said, correcting him. "One day it will be my son who rules. Simba will be your king." "Then long live the king," Scar said. Turning back toward his den, he slunk away, disappearing into the darkness. Watching him go, Mufasa let out a sigh. That was not how he had wanted things to go. True, he had been angry that Scar had skipped the ceremony, but a piece of him, however small, had hoped that maybe there had been a good reason, that perhaps with a new generation born, they could put aside their past. But clearly that was not going to happen. "What am I going to do with him?" Mufasa said, as he and Zazu began to make their way back to the top of Pride Rock. "Well, here's a thought," Zazu said, not hesitating to offer up his dream solution. "Why not drag him away with your massive teeth and claws?" Mufasa tried not to laugh. It was no secret that the Hornbill despised Scar. He wasn't sure if it was because of Zazu's loyalty to his king or the fact that Scar was so messy. Zazu despised disorder. "What?" Zazu said. "We both know he should have been expelled from the Pride Lands long ago." Mufasa's smile faded. "He's my brother, Zazu," he said, shaking his head. "This is his home. As long as I'm king, that will never change. No matter how difficult Scar makes it for me," he added silently. Chapter 3. Time passed as it does on the savannah. The circle of life continued to spin as dry weather gave way to wet. Lake beds evaporated and then filled. Herds thinned out and then grew bigger. Sunshine baked the ground, and then rain drowned it. And through it all, the lions of Pride Rock watched as their young prince grew bigger and bolder. The long days of napping in his mother's paws were over for Simba. His fur had darkened from days playing in the sun, and his belly had lost its chubbiness and become lean from constant activity. His eyes, bright and inquisitive, never stopped moving, and he rarely stopped talking. Only when sleep overcame him did he finally stop. But even in slumber, his paws moved as he dreamed of chasing antelope across the savannah. Waking from a particularly great dream involving helping his father save a family of topis from a flood, Simba stretched out his paws and arched his back. Then, lifting his head, he let out a loud yawn. Nearby, one of the other cubs stirred in his sleep, but then settled, nestling back into his mother's side. Simba waited for one more second, hoping to perhaps rouse a playmate, but after another yawn, intentionally louder this time, he realized he was going to have to find someone else to keep him company. Then his eyes widened. He didn't need someone to play with. He had totally forgotten what today was. Today, he was supposed to spend time with his dad, just like in his dream. Getting to his feet, he began to bounce and leap over the sleeping lionesses and their cubs until he reached the front of the den where his mother and father slept. Grabbing hold of Mufasa's tail, Simba pulled himself up and then began to crawl over the sleeping lion's massive back. While Simba had grown substantially since his introduction ceremony, atop his father, he still looked tiny. Reaching Mufasa's head, he flopped down on it and began to bat at the large lion's ear. "Dad, you awake?" he said. "Dad?" In answer, Mufasa let out a loud snore. "So you think pretending to snore will fool me?" Simba thought. His eyes narrowed and filled with mischief. "Well, we'll see about that." Leaning farther over, so his mouth was now directly in front of Mufasa's ear, he began to shout, "Dad! Wake up, Dad! 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 Sarabi opened one eye and looked at her son. Seeing that he wasn't bleeding, hurt, or in need of anything pressing, she closed the eye once more. "Your son is awake," she said, her voice thick with sleep. Beside her, Mufasa shook his head, giving Simba a ride in the process. "Before sunrise, he's your son," he said, not even bothering to open his eyes. This wasn't the first time he had awoken to the shouts, or teeth, of his precocious son. "Come on, Dad," Simba whined. "Let's go. You said I could patrol with you today, and today has started. You promised." Charging down his father's mane, Simba threw himself to the end and hung there, clinging to the tough hair with his small claws. "You up?" he asked. Only this time he was not whining. He was smiling, because he could see that while his dad might not have liked it, he was well and truly awake. Slowly, the king rose to his feet. Then he, too, let out a yawn. But unlike Simba's tiny one, this yawn bounced off the walls of the den and startled more than a dozen sleeping lions awake. "Let's do this," he said, shaking off the last of the sleep and giving Sarabi a quick nuzzle. Then together, he and Simba walked out of the den and into the early morning sunshine. Behind them, Sarabi watched, a smile on her lips. She knew Mufasa's hesitation was just an act. There was nothing he loved more than spending time with Simba. And if that gave her a few more moments of peace and quiet, it just made it all the sweeter. "So what's first?" Simba said, looking out at the savannah stretched before them. "Give orders for the hunt? Chase away evil intruders?" Rather than answer, Mufasa began to walk ahead. But instead of going down the rocks toward the ground below, he began to walk up to the very top of Pride Rock. Simba raced to catch up, leaping and falling as he struggled over the steep rock face. "Dad!" he shouted. "You're going the wrong way!" Still, Mufasa did not answer. Slowly and steadily he climbed. A few moments later, Simba arrived, out of breath and very confused. Looking over, he saw his father sitting with his back to the rock, his eyes focused on the horizon and the sun as it climbed ever higher. Simba walked over and sat down on the plateau next to him. He waited for a minute, which in Simba time felt like hours, and then finally he couldn't take it any more. "What are we doing? There's nothing up here," he said. Mufasa shook his head. "Look, Simba," he said, his deep voice serious. "Everything the light touches is our kingdom." Following his father's gaze, Simba took in the horizon and all the land that lay in front of it. His eyes grew wide. "Wow," he said softly, "you rule all of that?" "Yes," Mufasa said with a nod. "But a king's time as ruler rises and falls like the sun. One day, Simba, the sun will set on my time here and will rise with you as the new king." Simba nodded, hearing what his father was saying, but not quite processing it. There was something so serious, so sad in his father's tone, and it made him shiver unexpectedly. They had never talked like this before. And while he couldn't explain it, it made him sad too, to hear Mufasa speak of his own time ending. But then, as quickly as the flash of sadness came, it went, replaced by a sudden realization. "Wait," Simba said, perking up. "You're saying all of this will belong to me?" "It belongs to no one," Mufasa corrected with a shake of his large head. "But it will be yours to protect. A great responsibility." He turned his gaze from the horizon and looked down at Simba. The young cub knew nothing of responsibility, but he would all too soon. Lions grew up fast in the Pride Lands, and he needed his son to understand what was at stake. For a moment, Simba just stared out at the savannah, his mouth open in awe. "No way," he finally said. "Are you sure? Everything the light touches? Those trees and the watering hole and that mountain and—" He paused, scanning the horizon for still more. "Beyond those shadows?" Mufasa followed his son's gaze to the farthest point on the horizon, where the sun barely touched and the land seemed cast in permanent shadow. He shook his head. "For now, you must not go there, Simba," he warned. "But I thought a king can do whatever he wants," Simba said, looking confused. "Take any territory." Mufasa sighed. "While others search for what they can take, a true king searches for what he can give." Turning, Mufasa began to make his way back down Pride Rock. Simba paused, watching as his father easily maneuvered over the sharp rocks. "Someday, I'm going to be just like him," Simba thought. "And then I'll be able to go anywhere I want, and nothing will scare me, not even the Shadowlands." With a determined nod, Simba began to follow Mufasa. For a while, father and son walked in companionable silence, each lost in his own thoughts. As they made their way through the Pride Lands, Mufasa pointed out the small, almost secret sights of the kingdom, the caverns carved out of ancient rock that were home to long-horned bulls, the grove of trees that supplied food to one herd of elephants. Simba took it all in, his eyes wide. Watching a pair of bulls fight, the sound of their clashing horns bouncing off the cavern walls, he pressed himself closer to his father. He was going to be brave, and nothing was going to scare him. Someday. For now, he still liked having his father by his side. As they moved onto one of the longer parts of the flat savanna, Simba saw a herd of antelope leaping and bounding toward them. His heart began to pound, and he looked up at his father, hopeful for a fun chase. But Mufasa shook his head. "Everything you see exists together in a delicate balance," he said. "As king, you need to understand that balance and respect all the creatures, from the crawling ant to the leaping antelope." Simba cocked his head. "But Dad, don't we eat the antelope?" "Yes, Simba," Mufasa said. Simba started to nod proudly, but stopped when he saw his father wasn't done. "Let me explain. When we die, our bodies become the grass, and the antelope eat the grass, and so we are all connected to the great circle of life." "Sire!" Hearing the unmistakable voice of Zazu, father and son turned and looked back in the direction of Pride Rock. Zazu was flying toward them, his colorful beak seeming even brighter in the sun. "Morning, Zazu," Mufasa said, when the hornbill had landed in front of them. "Do you have the morning report?" Zazu gave a curt nod. "Yes, sire," he said. Then, puffing out his chest, he began. 10 flamingos are taking a stand. 2 giraffes were caught necking." As Zazu continued his report, he turned away from Mufasa. Catching Simba's eye, Mufasa crouched down and signaled for Simba to do the same. "Ready for some fun?" he whispered, motioning with his eyes in Zazu's direction. "Stay low to the ground." His belly just brushing the tips of the grass, Simba nodded excitedly. He eyed his target. "I got this," he said softly. "Check the wind," Mufasa went on, helping his son. But the cub was a natural. Even as Mufasa offered advice, Simba was one step ahead. He lifted his nose and checked his shadow to make sure it wouldn't give him away, all the while not moving a muscle as he readied to pounce. Zazu, completely oblivious to his part in the hunt, rambled on. "The buzz from the bees is that the leopards are in a bit of a spot. The tick birds have been tweeting again in the middle of the night. They can't stop." As Zazu went on, Simba inched a little closer. His tail swished ever so slightly, and his nose twitched. The wind was on his side. Still, he waited, letting Zazu finish. "The cheetah stole the baboon's dinner, and now the baboons are going ape. Of course, I always say, cheetahs never prosper." The bird started to laugh at his own pun, but stopped as he was tackled from behind. Rolling over, he looked up to find himself beak to nose with Simba. Mufasa let out a loud laugh as Simba proudly stood on his catch. Hemming and hawing, Zazu took to the air, shaking off his feathers. He looked utterly put out, and was about to point out that he was the king's aide, not the prince's plaything, when he spotted something in the distance. He squinted, wanting to be sure of what he saw before he sounded the alarm. But there was no doubt what it was. "Sire," he shouted, "hyenas in the Pride Lands. They're on the hunt." Instantly, Mufasa was on alert. The laughter died, and his expression grew fierce. Watching the transformation, Simba took a nervous step back. "Can you see Sarabi?" Mufasa asked Zazu. The hornbill nodded. "She and the lionesses are chasing them down." Pleased with the answer, Mufasa began to run. Sarabi and the other lionesses would keep the hyenas away long enough for him to get there. Then it would be up to him to remind the hyenas, in a not-so-gentle way, that they were not to set foot in the Pride Lands, per their agreement. He had run just a few feet when he came to a sudden stop. Turning, he called back to Zazu. "Take Simba home," he ordered. "Dad," Simba protested, "let me come. I can help." Mufasa shook his head. "No, son," he said. "You stay with the other cubs, where it's safe." His message delivered, he turned and began to race over the savannah. In moments, he was a mere speck in the distance. Watching him go, Simba hit the ground with his paw. His father was wrong. He was not a cub. He was almost a grown-up lion, and he should be helping his father save the Pride Lands. That was his duty. But no, now he had to go back to Pride Rock and hang out with the babies and Zazu. It just wasn't fair. Chapter 4. Simba sat at a distance, watching as several lion cubs laughed and chased each other around the area in front of the den. He scowled as one cub tackled another and then playfully bit the other cub's ear. A part of him wanted to join in their fun, but another part of him was still fuming from being left behind. Maybe, he thought, if I show Dad what a good hunter I'm becoming, he'll take me with him next time. With a determined nod, Simba scanned the area. He needed something to hunt. He saw Zazu perched on one of the higher rocks. Possible, but not great. He wanted a different challenge. And since he had already tackled Zazu that morning, he kept looking. The other cubs were a possibility, but then he would have to tell them what he was doing, and they would probably want to join him. Finally, His eyes landed on a beetle moving over the rocks. Its black back glistened in the sun, and it was moving at just the right pace. Slipping away from the rock, he crouched low, just like his father had taught him. Then he began to inch forward. He was so focused on tracking the beetle that he didn't even realize he was moving down the rocks, away from the den and toward the bottom of Pride Rock. He had just decided to make his move and pounce when a voice from behind startled him. "If you wish to kill something, you might want to stay downwind." Whirling around, Simba saw his uncle slowly amble out from the darkness of his cave. He paused in the entrance, half his body still in shadow. "I know how to hunt, Uncle Scar," Simba said. To prove himself, he turned and pounced, completely missing the beetle, and instead slamming headfirst into a rock. Behind him, Scar raised an eyebrow. "Let's hope we're never attacked by a beetle," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Then he nodded up toward the top of Pride Rock. "Go back to your den, Simba. I don't babysit." With a swish of his tail, he headed back into the cave. Watching him go, Simba cocked his head. "Babysit?" he repeated, following his uncle inside. He didn't need a babysitter. "I'm going to be king of Pride Rock. My dad showed me the whole kingdom, said I'm going to rule it all." "Is that so?" Scar said, sounding unimpressed. Simba nodded. Moving closer to his uncle, he glanced around the cave. He had never been inside his uncle's den before. He wrinkled his nose. It was dirty and smelled funny. It was cold, too. Down at the bottom of Pride Rock, it didn't get the warmth of the sun the way Simba's own den did. He shivered, suddenly wishing he hadn't strayed quite so far. But then he remembered that morning. He wasn't a little cub anymore. He didn't need to go running home. "Think about it," he said, focusing his attention back on his uncle. "When I'm king, I'll have to give you orders, tell you what to do, where to go. How weird is that?" "You have no idea," Scar said, coming closer. He looked down at Simba. "So, your dad showed you the whole kingdom?" he asked. Simba nodded. "Did he show you the shadows beyond the northern borders?" Simba stopped nodding and looked up at his uncle in surprise. How had Scar known that he'd asked his dad about that very spot? Simba frowned. Had Zazu told him? Had Zazu told everyone that his dad didn't trust him? His frown deepened. "He said I can't go there, ever." To his surprise, Scar nodded. "And he's absolutely right. An elephant graveyard is no place for a young prince." Scar stopped suddenly, looking guilty. "Oops." "Elephant graveyard?" Simba repeated, his eyes wide. "Whoa." No wonder his father wanted him to stay away. It was probably the coolest place ever, full of big bones and all sorts of stuff he had never seen. Then he cocked his head. But how could a place like that really be all that dangerous? Who would want to hang out with a bunch of bones? Still, it would be pretty amazing to see it. "Oh dear," Scar said, clearly reading the excitement on his nephew's face. "I've said too much. Well, I suppose you'd have found out sooner or later, you being king and all." Simba looked up at his uncle with awe. "You've been there," he said. Scar nodded, and Simba's eyes grew even wider. His father had always told him to leave Scar alone, but now that he was there, talking to him, Scar didn't seem all that bad. In fact, he was the only one who seemed to realize Simba would be king someday, and maybe deserve to know some things. But just as Simba started to feel like he and Scar could be friends, his uncle shook his head. "We've all been there, and it's no place for a cub," he said. At the word cub, Simba grimaced. But Scar's next words distracted him all over again. All those rotting bones and burning pools of oozing mud. Rotting bones, oozing mud. Simba felt as though he were about to leap out of his skin. He wanted to go there, now. Scar held up a paw. "Promise me you'll stay away, Simba," he said solemnly. "Now you run along." Reaching out, he gave Simba a little push. Simba tried to turn back, but his uncle didn't budge. Lowering his head, Simba sighed and began to make his way up toward Pride Rock. Just as he reached the path, he heard Scar call out his name. Turning back hopefully, Simba saw his uncle still standing where he had left him. "Remember," Scar called out, "it's our little secret, Your Majesty." With a nod, the older lion turned and slunk back into his den. "Our little secret," Simba repeated to himself. He could keep the secret. He wouldn't tell anyone that he had spent time with Scar, or that he had learned what lay in the shadows near the horizon. Well, he wouldn't tell almost anyone, because there was someone he definitely had to tell, when he convinced her to go with him to see the graveyard. Nala lay on her stomach, itching to move. Her mother, Serafina, was in the middle of giving her a bath, and Nala hated baths. She wanted to be out playing with the other cubs, or even better, she wanted to find her best friend, Simba, and do something with him. Maybe go to the watering hole, play a game of catch the tail on the lion cub, practice pouncing. But instead, she had gotten snatched up by her mother and was now being forced to sit still while every inch of her golden fur was licked. Her mother liked to pay special attention to the white markings that made Nala's coat unusual and beautiful. Nala had to admit, though, it felt kind of nice. It was part of her daily routine, and while she sometimes wished she didn't have to do everything her mother told her to do, being a cub was mostly pretty great. It meant she could play when she wanted and get meals whenever she was hungry, and she could always sleep tucked up next to her mother inside the safety of the den. Being part of Mufasa's pride was special, and Nala knew that. It was what she had been taught since she was born. Only days younger than Simba, she and the future king had grown up together, and when he was taught a lesson, so was she. When he learned about the kingdom, so did she. It was almost as if her mother had been grooming her to be a royal. The thought made Nala laugh. Her, royalty, that would be the day. Hearing footsteps at the entrance to the den, Nala lifted her head. A smile spread over her face as she saw Simba's curious eyes scanning the den for her. She tried to signal to him, but Serafina pushed her paw down and licked harder. Luckily, Simba spotted her anyway. "Nala!" Simba shouted as he raced over. "Come on, we have to go." "Where?" Nala said, trying to move and not having much luck. Simba looked like he was going to jump out of his skin with excitement. Nala smiled as he danced in front of her, unable to stop his tail from twitching. His brown eyes were wide, and his ears moved back and forth. He turned and pointed out of the den. "The watering hole," he said, as if that were the obvious answer. Before Nala could reply, Serafina shook her head. "Nala is having her bath," she said. To prove it, she resumed her licking. "And it's time for yours." Looking over, Nala saw Simba's mother, Sarabi, entering the den. Her own coat was dusty, but it didn't stop her from looking regal. She was a huge lioness, bigger than Serafina, with a wide head and large, knowing eyes. Nala had always been a little in awe of her. As queen, it was Sarabi's duty to provide for the lionesses and cubs. Mufasa helped, but Sarabi carried the majority of the weight on her strong shoulders. Nala knew her mother was Sarabi's best friend and right hand when it came to hunting. She hoped to someday be as fierce as both of them. As Simba protested, Sarabi lifted him by the scruff of his neck and sat down on a nearby ledge. She began to lick him, her rough tongue ridding his fur of the dirt from his earlier adventure outside. Finally, he broke free. "See, all clean," he said, twirling in front of Sarabi. "Can we go?" Sarabi raised her nose and sniffed the air. "There's no hyenas," Simba said, realizing what she was doing. "You just chased them all off." Nala looked up to see if Sarabi would snap at Simba, but instead she saw the lioness trying to hide a smile. Simba was hard to argue with. "Just to the watering hole, no further," she finally said, nodding in agreement. "Go through the high grass," Serafina said, releasing Nala from her grasp. Jumping to her feet, Nala raced over to join Simba. She waggled her eyebrows in excitement, and together, the cubs turned to go. But Sarabi wasn't done yet. "Stay downwind," she said. And one more little thing. Zazu will be going with you." At the same time, Nala and Simba let out groans of dismay. Taking the bird with them would take all the fun out of whatever adventure Simba had in mind, because if Nala knew one thing, it was Simba, and she knew he was up to something. He would tell her, but with Zazu along, she would probably have to wait. Chapter 5. So where are we really going? As they had been told to, Simba and Nala were making their way through the high grass of the savannah. The sun warmed their backs, and the ground underfoot was still soft from the wet season rains. Too soon, it would bake under the unrelenting sun, turning the ground hard and painful to walk on. But for now, it was enjoyable. And other than the sound of Zazu's off-key humming as he flew above them, it was also quite peaceful. At Nala's question, Simba looked over, surprised. She was always doing that to him, guessing when he had something up his sleeve. "How did you know?" he whispered, not wanting to catch Zazu's attention. Nala raised an eyebrow. "You hate the water," she said. Simba nodded. She had a point. He did hate the water, and he usually had to be dragged kicking and screaming to the watering hole. "I heard about this place, Nala," he said. "The most incredible, amazing. Just tell me where," Nala said, cutting him off. Simba smiled. That was one of the things that made Nala his best friend. She was always up for anything. "An elephant graveyard." "How far is it?" she asked. "Not far," Simba said, though he realized he wasn't exactly sure how far away the shadows were. "But don't worry, everyone's been there." For the first time, Nala looked slightly nervous. "What if we get lost?" Simba pushed ahead, brushing the grass out of his way. It was thinning out as they approached the watering hole. He didn't want to admit it out loud, but he had wondered the same thing. Getting lost sounded scary. Still, he couldn't sound weak or scared in front of Nala. After all, he was the future king, and Scar had said everyone had been there. There was probably a path or something. "Relax, Nala," he said. "I patrolled the entire kingdom this morning with my dad. There's nothing to worry about." "Well, there is one thing." Nala lifted her head toward Zazu. The bird was flying in circles, anxiously scanning the area in front of, behind, and to the sides of him, repeatedly. "We have an imminent threat," he suddenly screeched. Both cubs stopped in their tracks. "Something is approaching. Wait." Zazu's eyes narrowed, and then his beak opened and shut. "That's my own shadow." Relieved they were safe, and not at all embarrassed by his overreaction, Zazu continued to monitor. "When we get to the water, I want you both to stay in the shallow end." Ignoring the warning, the two cubs resumed walking. "How are we getting rid of the dodo?" Nala whispered a moment later, leaning over. Simba smiled. "Trust me," he said, puffing up his chest. "I got this. Just follow me to freedom." His words were cut off as he turned back and found himself face to face with Zazu. The bird had landed right in front of them without either of the cubs noticing. Simba's eyes narrowed. Maybe there was a reason his parents kept the bird around. "How lovely it is to see the future king with his future queen," Zazu said, looking back and forth between Simba and Nala. "I could just molt." Simba cocked his head. "What do you mean, future queen?" he asked. "Well, one day the two of you will be betrothed." Zazu's words were met with blank stares. "Intended. Affianced," he added. "Simba, you speak bird?" Nala asked, not understanding what the hornbill was trying to say. Simba shook his head. "Married," Zazu translated in frustration. "One day you will be married to each other." For one long moment, Simba just stared at Zazu. Then he looked over at Nala, then back at Zazu. Was the bird kidding? Married? To Nala? The thought of it seemed very strange to him. "Not going to happen, Zazu," he said, shaking his whole body as if that would get rid of the idea. "Nala and I are friends, and besides, she's afraid of rhinos. And he's never eaten an impala," Nala pointed out, clearly not into the idea either. Simba shot her a look. That wasn't entirely true. He had tried impala once. He just didn't like it. Too gamey. Once more he shook his head. They were never getting married. End of story. It didn't matter what the other did or didn't eat or like. They were friends, and they would be forever. Zazu did not seem impressed. "A monarch who ignores tradition," he said. "With an attitude like that, I'm afraid you'll be a pretty pathetic king." "Well, I'm not letting anyone tell me where to go, what to do, who to marry," Simba said, pushing past Zazu and continuing toward the watering hole. "There will never be a king like me." "Simba," Zazu shouted after him, "you can't escape your destiny." "Just watch," Simba shouted back. He wasn't just going to escape his destiny. He was going to escape the nosy hornbill, too. Pushing through the rim of grass surrounding the watering hole, he was happy when he surprised a flock of flamingos. As they took to the air, their pink wings dripping with water, Simba laughed. Zazu could say silly things and tell him he was going to be pathetic as a king, but Simba had bigger plans. He was going to be a mighty king. No, not just a mighty king. The mightiest king. As he and Nala began to run around the water, ducking and weaving among the legs of elephants, hippos, and zebras, Simba heard Zazu's frantic reminders to stay in sight, and ignored them. He meant what he had said. No one was going to tell him what to do. He would roar as loudly as he wanted. He would run around and go anywhere he wished. He would be free. And as king, if he wanted to change the rules, he would. Signaling to Nala, Simba jumped into a mud puddle, covering himself in the thick brown goo. Nala did the same. Emerging from the puddle, they slunk over and blended in among the elephants, who were also covered in mud to keep cool. Looking up, Simba saw that Zazu was still talking to him, though he clearly couldn't see him. With a flap of his wings, he turned, his back now towards Simba and Nala. Seeing his chance, Simba raced away from the elephants and along the bank of the watering hole, heading toward the far side. Nala followed close behind. They just needed to get to that side, and then they would be closer to the elephant graveyard and hopefully farther from Zazu. But suddenly, the hornbill turned and spotted them. "I know what you're doing," he shouted. "You can't hide from me, Simba. It's my sworn duty to keep you safe." Simba stopped in his tracks. Zazu was right. He couldn't hide from Zazu forever. But there was another way. Quickly, he jumped up onto a ledge over the bank of the watering hole. Then, he jumped in. The action startled the gathered animals. The zebras began to stomp their feet, and the elephants swung their long trunks, splashing water everywhere. Almost instantly, Nala and Simba were washed clean, and Zazu was soaked through. As he tried to flap his waterlogged wings, Simba and Nala ducked between a pair of young hippos. "You're coming home with me this instant," Zazu said, still following them, but falling farther behind. Simba had had enough. He was going to be king, and a king didn't need a babysitter. Glancing ahead, he smiled. A huge flock of birds had landed in front of them. Letting out a roar, Simba took off, racing right at them. As the hundreds of brightly colored birds lifted into the air, they blocked Zazu and gave Simba and Nala the chance they had been waiting for. Before anyone could stop them, they raced away from the watering hole and straight toward the shadowy lands on the horizon. "Simba," Nala said when they finally stopped running. She was out of breath, both from the run and the thrill of the escape. She had never done anything that exciting before. "We really lost him." Simba lifted his head and smiled. "I know what you're thinking," he said. "The future king is a genius." Nala gave him the stink eye. "You can't be serious," she said. "You never would have gotten halfway without the queen." She had been as shocked as Simba by the idea of them being betrothed, as Zazu put it, but she did like the idea of being a queen. After all, Sarabi was as powerful as Mufasa, at least when it came to the hunt and ruling the lionesses. Mufasa listened to her and trusted her opinion. "Aren't you forgetting something?" Simba said as they walked up the hill leading to a wide ridge. "There isn't going to be a queen." Nala frowned at her friend. Her earlier thoughts vanished. He was right. She didn't want to be a queen. Not if it meant marrying him. Ich! "I'd rather marry an aardvark," she said, shaking her head. "Good luck finding one that will say yes," Simba said, laughing. Nala stopped. She knew where this was going. The friendly teasing often led to this kind of moment. Simba was her best friend and the future king, but sometimes he needed to be reminded he wasn't king yet. Slowly, she began to lower her body so her weight was on the backs of her legs. "Good luck getting out of here without a bruising," she said. "Give it your best shot," Simba said, lowering his own body so the pair were now face to face. Nala waited. Simba always made the first move. He couldn't help himself. He was a show-off, and show-offs didn't like waiting. Sure enough, a moment later, Simba pounced. Nala was ready. In one smooth move, she reared up on her hind legs and met the force of his pounce head on. His momentum stopped. She quickly flipped him over onto his back. Throwing her own weight forward, she pinned him to the ground. Then she grinned. "I think you owe me an apology." "Never," Simba said, his voice wheezy as he struggled to push Nala off. Finally slipping free, he once again rushed Nala. But once again, she flipped him over. Only this time, instead of landing on the flat ground of the ridge, they fell over it and began tumbling down the hill onto the other side. Over and over they fell until they landed, Nala once more on top of Simba, at the bottom. "I'm waiting," Nala said, her tone teasing and her eyes bright. But to her surprise, Simba didn't say anything. Instead, his eyes were glued on something behind her. "Nala," he whispered, "what is that?" Nala shook her head. "You're not going to trick me, Simba," she said. "I know there's nothing—" Her voice trailed off, as she realized the sun was no longer warming her back, and her voice was bouncing off rocks. She shivered. Then slowly, she turned around. Her eyes grew wide as she looked at what they had tumbled into. Jagged rocks lifted high into the sky, casting everything in shadow. The ground was hard and burned white. There were no trees, no shrubs, not even the call of a bird. All Nala could see were bones, lots and lots of elephant bones. "This must be it," Simba said, getting to his feet. The initial fear Nala had seen in his eyes was gone, replaced with excitement. "Come on!" As he ran ahead, a thick layer of white dust drifted up into the air. Simba didn't seem to notice as he darted in and out of the bones, ducking under a huge set of ribs and leaping over a giant tusk. Following slowly, Nala tried not to cringe. These bones were all that was left of dozens of elephants. How had they come to be here? Why had they walked all this way? Was there some other reason they had ended up in this shadowy, desolate land? She loved to watch the elephant herds as they roamed the savannah. Next to the lions, of course, she thought they were the most majestic of all creatures. Seeing their bones made her sad. She shivered again. She had had enough. "Simba, we're way beyond the Pride Lands," she said. Simba paused on top of a tusk and looked over at her. "We've found it, Nala," he said, not sounding at all worried. In fact, he sounded proud. "You know what this means." "We can go home?" she answered hopefully. Simba shook his head. "It means they won't treat us like cubs anymore." Nala opened her mouth to point out that they were cubs, but stopped. She knew there was no point arguing with Simba. All he cared about was growing up and being king. To him, being taken care of and loved and fed were annoyances, whereas Nala, while she didn't love a bath, loved her mother and the den and her place in the pride. But Simba was her best friend, and she wasn't going to leave him, even if she didn't agree with him. Shrugging, she started to follow him when, suddenly, a strange sound whistled through the wind. Both she and Simba stopped. "What was that?" Nala asked nervously. "Just the wind moving through those rocks," Simba said. "Let's go check it out." Sighing, Nala watched as Simba bounded off. He was going to get them into trouble, she was sure of it. She just had to hope it wasn't any trouble they couldn't get out of, and that Mufasa wouldn't blame her, at least not entirely.